Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our session, Understanding Sectoral Skills in Understanding Sectoral Skills. This is the second session to accompany our new how-to guide, Understanding Local Economic Performance, which is goes through data available on skills. Now, these webinars are short, hour-long sessions to help busy policymakers better understand evidence on economic growth. There are plenty more of our previous sessions that you'll find both on our website and on our YouTube channel. So do feel free to check those out and to share them with colleagues afterwards. So I'm Megan Streb. I'm Deputy Director of Outreach at Warwick Centre for Local Economic Growth. We help to make local growth policy more cost-effective through better use of evidence and robust impact evaluation. So today's session is going to be a presentation walking through some of the available skills data, thinking about sectors, and then we're going to follow it up with a Q&A. So please submit questions throughout in the Q&A function, and we will come to them towards the end. We are live streaming this, so again, this is going to be available on YouTube afterwards or now if you're watching through that instead. And without further ado, I would like to welcome our Deputy Director of Evidence, Victoria Sutherland.
Hello, welcome everybody. I am just going to share my screen, so bear with me for 2 seconds. Okay, Megan, could you thumbs up to let me know that that's...
Nope, that's in presenter view.
Oh, okay. Okay, hold on.
This worked perfectly 3 minutes ago. There we are. Excellent. Right, over to you, Victoria.
Okay, great. So we're going to talk about sectoral skills today. And as Megan, oh goodness, as Megan mentioned, this is the second of 2 sessions that we've done. So last week we had a session where we were really just thinking about kind of skills, what are the core concepts in skills, what are some of the areas that you might want to look at skills data for your local area. We obviously don't know how many of the people who are here today were here last week, so I'm not going to talk about skills in the general, kind of in much detail, but I just want to recap on a few things in case anybody wasn't here, or indeed, you know, for those that were here last week, it's always good to have a little bit of repetition because it will help frame how we think about sectoral skills. So skills are essentially what you need to be able to complete a task successfully. And obviously those tasks are going to vary very dramatically. So the tasks that a nurse needs, or the tasks that a nurse needs to be able to complete are very different to those that, let's say, a teacher needs to complete or an accountant needs to complete. There'll be some overlap. There'll be some things that are common across occupations, but the tasks are different, and therefore the skills are different. And skills really are a mix of the knowledge and the competence and the abilities that you need to complete a task. So it's not enough just to have knowledge, you've got to be able to actually implement it as well. And we develop skills in varied ways. So I think we tend to mainly focus on those that we develop in formal settings, so in education or through training courses. But we all develop skills in informal settings as well, both within the workplace and outside of the workplace. Obviously, when we're beginning to think about individual sectors, you're going to tend to have a mix of skills within any individual sector. So you will have things that are transferable, so things like problem solving and communication skills. You might even have things that are transferable, so a little bit of data analysis skills or a little bit of coding skills. But often once you begin to get into an industry, we're looking at non-transferable skills and often kind of technical hard skills. So there are things within each individual industry and sector that are specific to that sector. And then within that, you might well have skills that are specific to an individual business. Another thing just to note on before we go forward is like, well, why are we interested in skills? And we're interested in skills really because they're one of the key drivers of productivity. So we want our businesses to be productive because that leads to higher wages and higher living standards, and also helps keep them competitive within the markets that they serve. And that competitive is important if we want to kind of sustain employment levels. So because skills are one of the drivers, they're one of the ways that businesses can become more productive. We see them as really important. And actually, they've become more important over time. So because skills, because we've moved from a manufacturing economy to a service sector economy, so about 70% of jobs are in services, what that means is that skills are more important. So if we think about there being tangible capital, so that's things like machinery, intangible capital, so that's things like software and design and branding, and human capital, which is skills. The intangible capital and the human capital become more important as we've shifted towards services, just because they make they make a larger contribution to service sector products than manufacturing sector products. And then last week we also talked a little bit about some core concepts. So essentially, when we're looking at a labour market, we're looking at demand and supply. And always worth reiterating that it's the employers who are demanding the skills and the individuals who are supplying the skills. We're going to have multiple overlapping labour markets, so we tend to refer to the labour market, but that's actually not true. There's lots of different labour markets broken out by different occupations, by different industries, and kind of the intersection of them will define the size of a labour market. So if we think about a big city, so if we think about London or Leeds or Edinburgh, they're places where there'll be a large number of businesses and therefore jobs in things like professional services, financial services, etc. And because those jobs are quite high productivity and they pay quite high wages, they're able to pull in labour from a much larger area than something that's perhaps lower skilled and lower wage. So perhaps something like tourism, which plays an important role in lots of economies, but doesn't tend to pay very highly, and therefore people don't tend to commute large distances to jobs in that sector. So when we're thinking about demand and supply, something that we're always thinking about is how well aligned is that? And again, when we're thinking about sectors, this becomes important because sectors will have very specialist needs often, and it can be, when something's more specialist, it can be more difficult to get that to get supply right for the level of demand, especially if it's in a sector that's perhaps changing quite rapidly. So perhaps demand's increasing quite fast. Often we end up with mismatches because the provision's not catching up. It's not bringing enough new people with the skills into that labour market. And then final point is just about constraints. So constraints are anything that limits a labour market's ability to adjust to that changing demand or changing supply. So that's our kind of core concepts in relation to skills. We also need to think a little bit about what do we mean by a sector. So I always think, so I almost probably use sector and industry interchangeable. When you go and look at definitions of sectors and industries, sometimes the argument is a sector is broad and an industry is narrow, and sometimes you'll get it the other way around. I think I think in the past in the UK, we probably would have thought of sectors as something quite broad and industry as something quite narrow. I feel people use them kind of interchangeably now, so I wouldn't get too hung up on kind of the order. But essentially, a sector and industry is a collection of businesses or a collection of organisations, if it's something that's in the public sector, that produce a similar good or service. Okay, so what we're essentially doing is we're saying these are businesses that are all producing something that is alike. Okay, now obviously sometimes that's sometimes the project is quite commoditized and therefore it's like in all its features. Okay, and sometimes it's something that's alike, but if I said to my brother-in-law that my trainers are similar to his trainers, he would very definitely argue that they're not, and they've got very different, criteria. They've got very different, aspects. So sometimes how similar it is varies a little bit. And then what we do is we tend to define them in different degrees of granularity. So you can have very, very broad sectors. You can have something like manufacturing or professional services or, kind of health or education. But we can also define them much more narrowly. So when I worked in the northeast of England, one of our important sectors was life sciences, and that was because we had quite a lot of manufacturing of pharmaceuticals. So obviously manufacturing of pharmaceuticals is something much narrower than manufacturing as a whole. So always worth thinking about how granular do you want to look, okay? I think something that's important to think about is that businesses in a sector are likely to face similar skills issues, okay? And that those skills issues may be similar to the economy as a whole, but they might be quite distinctive, okay? So it might be that, I think I used this example last week, but I think it's a good one. In the kind of mid-2000s, we were going through a little bit of a construction boom. And one of the real challenges with that was that actually we'd been very bad at training apprentices for kind of the previous 10, 15, 20 years. And therefore, we just didn't have enough labour. And that actually encouraging people back into that sector, but also getting them through the training, because construction because it uses apprenticeships, has a very kind of formal route in, was causing particular problems. So generally most of the firms that we would go and talk to at that time would be talking about the same things. It was about, a lack of people coming into the industry, but also a lack of people who had kind of 5 years, 10 years experience that could take on more managerial roles. So you'll often get similar issues across businesses, which is why there's lots of reasons why you might want to look at sectoral analysis, but that's one of them, is that actually you can begin to kind of drill down on what the issues are and make sure that you're meeting the needs of a particular sector. I just want to talk about one final concept. So you'll often hear people talk about clusters. Okay, and I've been doing economic growth stuff for about 25 years, and I feel like clusters kind of come in and out of kind of, people's interest in them, whether or not we have policies that are structured around them. Clusters are slightly different to industries. So a cluster is geographically concentrated, and there's quite a lot of debate about how geographically concentrated something needs to be, like whether it needs to be, essentially a couple of wards, or whether it can be, as large as perhaps an MSA area. In America, they used to argue that it had to be somewhere where you could drive in the morning, do a day's worth of meetings and drive back. But it always strikes me that Americans drive much further than us. So I think that's a hard one. So there's got to be geographic concentration. And what you have is an interconnected set of businesses and other institutions. So things like perhaps skills providers, research institutions, kind of, support services, etc. But the point here is that they don't necessarily all need to be in a single sector or industry. What they have to be is in a set of interconnected sectors and industries. So often when you've got a sector, you might have perhaps a number of different sectors, some of which are suppliers to the others. So if I work for a long time in Glasgow, and this is kind of not how the Glasgow economy looks now, but shipbuilding was a massive industry in Glasgow for a very long time. And the point was, we didn't just have shipbuilding, we had a whole assortment of other engineering based businesses. And we had an awful lot of professional services and financial and insurance services that also served that market. And it was the collection of things together that created the strength rather than just the shipbuilding itself. I think the most famous cluster is Silicon Valley. There's always a lot of interest in whether or not you can grow and develop a cluster. I think there's very little evidence that any area has ever successfully developed a cluster from scratch, but there is some good evidence that policies can help support and grow a cluster that already exists. Okay. So when we're thinking about sectors, we need a way of defining them. So if you think about other kinds of analysis that we might do, so last week when we were talking about skills, we did a little bit of analysis where we looked at population by age. Now, yes, you have to decide what your age bands are, but there's only so many different options that you can choose from. Similarly, if you're looking at qualification levels of your population, you kind of go with the defined qualification kind of categories. When we're looking at sectors, we need a framework for doing that. And for most of the data that's published, at least by ONS and by government, it uses a thing that's called a standard industrial classification. Okay, so the standard industrial classifications are developed by Office for National Statistics. They do them relatively infrequently. So the last one that we've got is the one that was defined in 2007. So we're obviously kind of almost 20 years out from that. My understanding is that there is a new one coming relatively soon. And we do these in concert with other statistical agencies worldwide so that there's kind of consistency on a country by country basis. So the SIGCOs are great. I mean, apart from anything else, they give us a consensus way of kind of looking at sectors, but they also have different levels of granularity. So you can get those very broad sectors, professional services, health, education, manufacturing, but you can also get right down to really, really small niche sectors. So they have 5 different levels of granularity. I should say, in terms of the stuff I'm going to show today, I'm not going to show anything below what's called the 2-level SIC. You can go all the way down to 5-level SIC. So we're not actually going to even look at anything particularly granular today. Challenge is, though, not all data sets have that level of granularity. Sometimes they only have the top level or the top couple of levels. There's also a whole host of challenges in using the standard industrial classification. So you might ask, how do we know what each business is? The way we know is that when they register at Companies House, they have to pick a SIC code. Now, as you can imagine, given that you can get down to 5 levels of granularity, there's lots of them, okay? So you're partly dependent on the business having classified themselves as the right thing, okay? So some businesses are going to be more diligent about going through the whole list and considering it. I'm pretty confident that a lot of businesses just tick the first one that they come to that kind of aligns with what they do. You can also have real challenges in terms of like what a business does. So it's very easy to think about, like if you ran a local cafe, it's probably pretty self-apparent about what you do. Okay. Or maybe even if, you run a manufacturing business, perhaps you produce a single product and it's quite clear which of the boxes that you fit into. But lots of companies do multiple things. They produce multiple different goods and services. And therefore, it becomes a bit more difficult to figure out what is the right SIC code for that business to sit in. And often you can also end up with complications where, for very large firms, they often have quite complex holding structures where there are multiple different firms that have been set up. So when you're thinking about a company, it may in fact be multiple companies within the data, and each of them might have a slightly different SIC code. So definitely, I've done pieces of work in the past where we've been looking at skills for a sector in a particular area, and the numbers looked a bit off. And it was because when we went to look for a couple of the big employers that we knew were in that sector, actually they had a slightly different SIC code to what we had initially assumed. The final thing, and the thing that you will hear most often, I think, as criticism of SIC codes, is that because we define these alongside kind of international partners, and because we haven't done this very often, one of the real challenges can be as new industries and sectors emerge, it can be difficult to, like, what can happen is they don't have a natural home. And what ends up happening is they end up disparate across different SIC codes. So the one that's kind of most obviously an issue around this is green industries. So we know that the economy is going to go through a massive transition. It's already going through a transition, but has a long, long way to go. But a lot of the things that we think of as green jobs are spread across a range of different manufacturing industries, construction industries, professional service industries, and there's probably more. So it becomes really hard to understand the scale of, the scale of the issue, what the trends over time are, if actually something isn't, easy to find. In a similar way, lots of IT, we do have information and communications as a category, but there's lots of IT stuff that's spread actually across other industries. Because of this criticism, what you find is that there are a lot of commercial providers that are coming forward with kind of solutions to this. A lot of those solutions are based on web scraping, or sometimes it might be a company that actually owns the data. So you might get, for example, a large recruitment provider being able to produce data based on the data, of the vacancies that they're advertising, or, LinkedIn in terms of what's happening in terms of their members. I think all of this stuff is really interesting. I think definitely it can add to our understanding of sectors. But one of the challenges is that each of these companies is approaching this in a slightly different way. So we don't have consistency across measures, and we don't have a consensus yet about which of these approaches, which of these measures is most appropriate. So that particularly comes into play when you're perhaps comparing your local area to a different local area. So for example, if you were looking at your piece of research that you had commissioned and somewhere else had published a piece of research on the same sector in their area, but they'd gone with a different provider or a different definition, you can't necessarily kind of compare what's happening in the two different geographies. And similarly, you might have something local and there might be a national report and you can't necessarily compare. One final thing I just want to flag on this kind of idea of defining is within these parameters, you can define your own sectors, okay? So what I mean by that is something like creative industries. So creative industries have been with us for a long time. they're growing in importance within the economy, but a little bit like green industries, they're a little bit scattered across the different SIC codes. So because you've got these different codes, one of the things that you can do is you can build your own sector. So you could identify the individual SIC codes that you think are in creative industries, and then you can create an aggregate of all of those different SIC codes. And actually, if you're pulling out data for NOMIS in particular, it allows you to do it. It's got to create your own industry kind of functionality where you can define it and save it, and then you can come back and use it. That's particularly useful, I think, if you are an area that has defined some key sectors that you're interested in, because it means that you know that you and colleagues are always coming back and looking at it on the same basis. You're using the same collection of SIC codes. Right. Any questions so far, Megan?
No.
No.
Okay. I mean, I have loads.
Okay.
But let's I mean, people are probably mulling things over and starting to think, okay, what does this actually mean for me?
Yeah.
So I'm sure questions will be coming in shortly.
Okay, great. Okay, that's fine. I'm really conscious that we've done lots of slides that are kind of text-based. So I just wanted to stop. Okay, let's move on then. But yeah, everyone do keep sticking your questions in the chat, and we'll stop again in a bit to run through some of them. Okay, so you'll remember when I talked about concepts, I talked about demand and supply. So let's start with demand. So those of you that were here last week, I said this last week, but it's worth repeating. We don't actually really have great data on skills demand generally. And the reason for that is, like, it's hard to measure demand on its own. So the thing that we tend to use is we tend to use employment. And employment's a good, it's a good way of thinking about demand. Like if there wasn't the demand from the employer, that job wouldn't exist. But the whole point is that for the employment to be counted, the job has to be filled. And therefore, you could end up with some demand for employment being missed because the job hasn't been filled and therefore it's not being counted. Okay, but it's as good as we can probably get. Something that's worth thinking about is, like, when we look at the data on skills by industry, we're going to have some commonalities. Okay, so I think most people know that the NHS is nearly always the largest employer in every, in every local authority area, and therefore it should not be surprising when we look at data on an industry basis that health is going to come out as a really kind of significant employer. Similarly, we have schools in all areas, so education is going to be high, although that might vary a bit depending on whether you've got colleges and universities as well. Other things like retail, we've got shops in all kinds of areas. So some industries you're going to see a common thread, regardless of what geography you're looking at, as being large, okay? Whereas others are going to be more specialist. So let's take a very easy example. Aberdeen in the northeast of Scotland is where most of the oil and gas industry is based, and therefore what you're going to see is you're going to see high numbers in relation to energy, high numbers in relation to kind of professional services, because there's lots of kind of engineering consultancy type stuff. Similarly, if you went to Edinburgh, Edinburgh's got a lot of financial services, so you're going to see a real kind of specialism there. So I'm going to look at kind of two things here. So we're going to look at how demand varies across different sectors, and we're also going to look at specialisms, because I think looking at both of those gives us a kind of interesting take on what does the sectoral profile of a local area look like. I think, as I said earlier, I haven't done this in very much detail. So I've used the very kind of broadest categories for looking at demand across sectors, and then I've looked at a kind of medium level of granularity for looking at the specialisms. It's worth saying that having even just using the broadest category for looking at the sectoral kind of profile, I've actually had to put it onto two charts because it was too tiny really for looking on the screen. I think just because PowerPoints are kind of very much a kind of landscape format. Obviously, if you've got portrait format, like you can do in a report, you can do a kind of you can do a lot more categories. So again, just because this is the data that we used in the guide, we'd picked Wakefield as our kind of example place. So what I've done is I've taken all employment in Wakefield and all employment in England, and I have broken it down into its respective categories. And I've ordered it kind of highest to lowest for Wakefield. So what we can see here is we can see that health is the largest sector in Wakefield. It's employing 13.7% of all workers in Wakefield. So that is very similar to the England level. In fact, it's very slightly higher than the England level, but most probably, not in a significant way. Our next two biggest sectors in Wakefield are transport and storage, and then manufacturing. So they each employ 12.5% of the population. So actually between those two sectors alone, you're at a quarter of everybody who's employed in Wakefield. And what's really notable here is that that is a much, much larger proportion than across England as a whole. So only about 5% of workers across England work in transport and storage, and only about 7% work in manufacturing. So we're already beginning to be able to see like what the profile of Wakefield looks like and how that compares. Okay, when we go down kind of further on this chart, we can see that retail's slightly underrepresented. It's probably because it's not a major retail centre. I'm guessing people in that area most probably are travelling to Leeds for some of their shopping needs. Education's underrepresented, and that's, I suspect, because Wakefield has neither a college or a university within its patch. It might also be a little bit to do with age profile. So I can't off the top of my head remember what Wakefield's age profile looks like, but perhaps they've got a smaller proportion of people aged 0 to 15, and that means they have slightly fewer schools and so forth. Overrepresented in terms of public admin and defence, underrepresented in terms of accommodation. Wholesale's interesting because it's overrepresented, and I suspect that's connected to the transport and storage that we've seen above. And then if we look further down, again, there's some really interesting things. So if we look at professional, scientific and technical, information and communication, and financial and insurance, they are some of the most productive sectors and some of the sectors that are growing the fastest within the national economy. And Wakefield is really underrepresented in relation to all of these. So doing this kind of analysis, I think is really useful. It's really useful in terms of, it gives us a sense of who are the biggest employers, but also how are we doing in comparison? What are we overrepresented in and what are we underrepresented in? And those two things are really useful, both in terms of thinking about skills interventions, but also in terms of thinking of other interventions. So for example, I would want to be confident that our local skills providers were providing the routes and the courses into the sectors that are large, but also the ones that are overrepresented, because it might be that something that's overrepresented, it is something where actually you need something that's a little bit different in terms of provision. So knowing what your profile looks like can be really useful in terms of thinking about skills provision and what you need. But the other thing is it tells you a little bit about some of your strengths and your weaknesses as an economy. So that might tell you a bit about where do we want to be focusing on business advice? If we're thinking about inward investment, where should we be focusing? So just knowing this stuff about employment actually can have lessons kind of beyond the skills provision. Can also tell us important things about things like careers advice and guidance. Like having good intelligence about what your sectoral profile looks like and what occupational profiles look like is really critical in terms of informing your young people about what the options might be. Okay, so the other thing that I think is really useful to do in relation to skills demand is to look at specialisms. And the thing that we use quite often to look at a specialism is called a location quotient. So if we think about the previous chart, when we were looking at health, it was about 13-14% of employment in Wakefield and 13-14% of employment in England that was in health. So if you divided the proportion of employment that's in that sector in Wakefield by the proportion of that employment, a proportion of total employment that's in that sector in England, you get a figure of roughly 1. Okay. However, the sectors where 7.5% of employment in Wakefield was in a sector, but actually only 2.5% of employment across England was in that sector, you'd get a location quotient of 3. So it tells you kind of how overrepresented you are. So what we've got here is we've got the top 10 sectors defined using 2-digit SIC codes that are overrepresented within Wakefield. Okay. But what I've also done is I've also put employment data down. So what you can see is the sector that is most overrepresented in Wakefield is the manufacturer of wearing apparel. Okay. But it only employs about 700 people. So it's important to kind of understand your specialisms, but you need to think carefully about, if you're going to focus attention on supporting particular sectors, it's also important to know how large they are. So in particular, you would not necessarily want to be focusing on the manufacture of coke and refined petroleum products, because yes, it is very overrepresented, but it only employs 100 people, whereas you was probably much more interested in making sure that warehousing and support activities for transportation was being supported effectively, because it has 15,000 people and it is, significantly overrepresented within the economy. So I think when we're looking at demand, we look at demand generally because what we want to do is we want to understand the profile of our local economy. When we turn to skills, what we tend to do is we tend to be drilling into a sector that we have identified as being important by looking at the demand data. Before we go on to talk about supply, I see that there are 3 questions. So will we stop and take them, Megan?
Sure. So we've had a couple. So one was just a quick reminder of NOMIS and its ability to aggregate SIC codes and make your own industry. And Victoria, can you just clarify within NOMIS, is it that true anytime that you're looking at like a data set by industry?
No. So it depends on the individual data set. The charts and tables that I've just shown you all use a thing called the Business Register and Employment Survey. You can do it within that. You can also do it within a data set that's called UK Business Counts. So that's not specifically about skills, but that allows you, in the same way that BRES gives you a count of employment, so how many people are employed, UK Business Counts gives you a count of the number of businesses. So they're the two main data sets that you can do it within NOMIS.
Great. Okay, other questions that we had. So one was more of a comment. So using something like Lightcast, and I know that there's a few other ones that you can purchase. So that job posting platforms can be used in order to help understand skills demand at an occupation level.
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. And that's, I mean, that flags something that I think is quite important that I haven't actually talked about, which is when you're looking at data on skills, always think about stocks and flows. Okay, so what I've looked at here are stocks. We're looking at the number of the count of employment. Okay, so that's a stock. How much, how many people are employed in these industries at the current moment in time. I appreciate there's a bit of a lag with data, but as current as we can get. So you're looking at stocks. Also really important to look at flows. So flows are about what is changing over time, and looking at vacancies is one way of looking at the flows. You're looking at, how many jobs are being advertised in a particular industry at a particular point of time. So it's very much a flow. When we go on to look at skills supply in a minute, we'll be looking at flows, just because that's where the majority of the data that we have on skills supply at the sectoral level is.
And then there's a question about kind of cutting across sectors. So about ways that transferable skills are used by employers when recruiting, when maybe thinking about what it is that they need.
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. I think most employers tend to have a good sense of what they need for a particular role. And that's always going to be a combination of transferable and non-transferable skills. And a mix actually of hard and soft skills as well. I think the challenge comes often when employers are looking for a mix that doesn't necessarily exist within the labour market, or at least doesn't exist to the quantities and to the qualities that they require. So you might have someone who has a good mix of technical skills, but that within your workplace they need to be applied in a particular kind of way, and that people maybe don't quite meet that requirement. And definitely when we look at, like, there's skill shortage vacancy data that you can get, and not by industry, but you can get it by occupation. That's going to vary across, different occupations, different places, etc. Yeah.
Okay. I think that's helpful. And I think also that understanding that I think that skill shortage data probably also helps to build up that understanding of maybe what that looks like across the economy.
Okay.
Okay. We have a little less than 15 minutes to tackle skills supply.
Okay, great. Okay, so sorry, struggling to get it to move on. Okay, so skill supply, as I said in the answer to the question, most of the data that we've got in skill supply is about how many people are developing a set of skills. So it's a flow. And there is no single data set that you can go and look at on this. what you need to do is you need to look at data on apprenticeships, data on further education, data on higher education. So in the first two cases, that data mainly comes from Department for Education, or if you're in one of the devolved administrations, their equivalents. Higher education data comes from a thing called the Higher Education Statistics Authority, so HESA. And actually, it's quite useful. You can often get data for that for individual universities. So once you know what the profile is, you can kind of your universities, you can build it up. Some things to think about when you're looking at data on skills supply is to think about whether the data is counting people who live in your area or who are studying in your area. So is it the individuals or is it about the institution? Okay, and then linked to that, it's always worth thinking about, okay, well, these skills are being developed within my area or by people who are living within my area, but are they going to stay within my area? Or is there a chance that these skills will leave? So, for example, skills developed through apprenticeship, in particular, if that's someone who's resident in your area and they're an apprentice at a local employer, there's a reasonably good chance that those skills are going to remain within your area. Higher education, skills that are developed through higher education, there's actually a much lower chance that they will stay in the area because people who have obviously come from different places to study, they're perhaps developing skills that are specialist to an industry that might not be located within your area. So there's all sorts of dynamics that might affect that. The other thing to think about is, what is the actual measure I'm looking at or that I want to look at? So do we want to look at the number of people who are starting a course? Do we want to look at the number of people that are completing a course? And sometimes looking at the ratio between those two gives really good insights. Are we looking at the total number of people who are currently studying? Or in some cases, you're able to look at the outcome. So, has the person moved into employment, etc. So obviously across those dimensions, there's lots of different data. I've just picked one thing to look at here, which is enrolments at higher education. So because Wakefield doesn't have a university of its own, what we've done is we have done universities within West Yorkshire. So what you can see is that by far the largest subject is business and management. And then we've got subjects allied to medicine. So that's everything like nurses, physios, etc., occupational therapists. And then again, I've had to split this one over two slides. Once we go down, things where there's much smaller numbers of students are things like agriculture, geography, maths, architecture, etc. Oh, sorry, gone the wrong way. If we think about, you'll remember kind of on the previous charts, what we saw was that manufacturing was one of the industries that was really quite overrepresented. Both when we looked at the breakdown of employment, but also when we looked at the specialisms, lots of them were in manufacturing industries. So realistically, the course that's likely to be of most relevance to that is engineering and technology. We know about 30% of graduates in engineering and technology nationally go on to work in manufacturing. So we can see that there's a really large number here. There's 6,300. So even if about 30% of them went on to work in manufacturing, that's about 1,800 people potentially that are coming out of universities in West Yorkshire on an annual basis who are, going to end up in that industry. So that's a good number. But what we don't know from this chart is whether they're going to stay in West Yorkshire, and even if they stay in West Yorkshire, whether they would take a job in Wakefield as opposed to one of the other areas within the locality. So we've done this here just for enrolments in HE, but we could do the number of students in HE, we could do the number of graduates, we could look at where those graduates have gone, and then we could do all of the same things for apprenticeships and for different kinds of further education. So I think because this is quite a short session, there's only a certain number of things that we can look at in the time available. And in the main, what we've done here is we've kind of looked at counts, or we've looked at a breakdown, and we've looked at for one period of time and kind of one geography, or occasionally kind of comparing against England. I think I would really encourage you that when you begin to look at this data, to look at it in lots of different ways. So do comparisons across areas, do comparisons over time, so how are those enrollments, are they tracking up or are they tracking down? Look at different breakdowns. So I've picked quite high level, subjects. You could do more detailed subjects. You could break it out into undergraduates and postgraduates. Or if you were doing the demand data, you could do kind of different granularities of the sectors, etc. And occasionally combining data sets. So the enrollments, we could combine that with population and kind of do enrollments per capita or something like that. And that again might give us some additional insights. Okay. I've done lots of stuff on sectoral skills throughout my career. And the thing I want to say is I've talked about some data sets here. We talk about some, a little bit more about it, kind of issues to consider in the guide. But it's hard to get a really great picture of your sector from just looking at the national data broken down by sector and geography. Okay, we have data, but we don't have masses of data. Okay, there's only a certain number of things that we're able to look at when you've got those two levels of breakdowns. So I think if you're looking at sectoral skills, it is worth looking broader than just the data. So a number of different things that I think are worth having a think about. So look at what exists nationally on sectoral skills. So what you will often find is you will find a government department or a government agency or an industry body, or some other, kind of organisation with an interest in the sector will have done stuff looking at the sectoral needs of the industry nationally. Okay, now sometimes you're going to have particular bits of the supply chains or particular niches, and it might not apply. But I think if you can combine what data you've got with broader research that tells us the direction of travel of the sector, what its emerging skills needs are, you're going to have a fuller picture of what's required. Similarly, I'd really strongly encourage you to see what local intelligence you can gather. So, at the most costly, most detailed end of that, would be doing surveys of local employers. But depending on the size of the sector and the resources you've got, sometimes actually just being tapped into local networks, having good relationships with providers to understand, what courses they're running, whether they're getting enough demand for them, whether their engagement with employers suggests that it's hitting the right time. Just gather what intelligence you can given, whatever capacity that you've got. And I think having a bit of data, a bit of national stuff, and some local intelligence together will help you build up a kind of better picture. I've obviously talked about the fact that there are commercial data sets available. We feel as a What Works Centre, it's not our role to say, go spend your money on this one, but I do think it's worth exploring what's out there and whether it meets your needs. And one final thing is quite often we have data that's broken down by occupation, but not by industry. Now, obviously, occupations and industries are different, but sometimes you will end up with an overlap. So, for example, UK Employment Employer Skills Survey breaks things like skills gaps down by occupation. Okay. And if we take Wakefield again as example, we saw that manufacturing was a large employer. A lot of jobs in manufacturing will be what are called process plant and machine operatives. So what you could do if you knew that sector was important to your local economy, as it is in Wakefield, you could go and look at how is Wakefield doing for that occupational category. So it's a very rough and ready way of looking at it, but sometimes looking at occupations will give you some insights that you might not get from other places. Okay, so that's me finished. Do we have other questions in the chat, Megan?
So someone has mentioned the Skills England report, assessment of priority skills to 2030. So what I might do is follow up with attendees with a link to our guide, a link to maybe some of these other data sets that maybe of interest to people. There's loads of links that you'll also find within the guide itself. So yeah, absolutely worth looking at some of the stuff that's coming out through Skills England and also some of the other like industry bodies as well as they're thinking about skills and skill needs. That's probably all the time we have, so that I make sure that people that we finish on time for sure. So the guide links to both these recordings and our previous recordings you'll find on our website, whatworksgrowth.org. You'll also find evidence reviews that we've got on apprenticeships and employment support, both of which touch on the issue of skills and interventions to support elements of skills. If you haven't signed up for our newsletter, you'll find that at the bottom of every webpage on our website. That's the best way to hear about future events and when our updated, when we'll have new publications. So this how-to guide is going to be the first of several. So do definitely keep your eye on our newsletter over the coming months as we keep adding these. This recording is also on our YouTube page, so you'll find previous webinars on there as well. Please share them with colleagues. Please share them with new starters. A lot of this stuff is really good introductions. If someone is brand new to skills, we also have an overview of skills as part of our series, Core Concepts on Economic Growth. You'll also find that on our website. Hopefully we will see you at another event soon. And I think that's all from us today. Oh, one last thing. If you are in local government and you haven't already, do consider joining our online forum for people in local government who are working on economic growth. It's khub.net. Once you've signed up for that using your gov.uk email address, you can then search for us. It's local economic growth in the UK. You can ask us questions. You can ask colleagues questions. We have over 100 local authority and combined authority officers from across the UK. So there's a wealth of expertise there. If you have other questions about, some of the practical aspects of working on your skills strategy or anything else local growth related. Right, that is the final thing. Hope to see you at another event soon. Thank you very much.